Good evening, everybody. This is Nevin, your host of the Politically Homeless podcast. With me is my frequent guest, geopolitical analyst, J.R. Nyquist. Hey, Jeff, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing okay, Nevin.
Good, good, good. All righty. Tonight we're going to be talking about Ukraine. And what I am seeing is a disturbing trend where the reputation of Ukraine is being blackened by a variety of political forces here in the United States. And I see a pattern very similar with what happened to South Vietnam progressively during the 1960s and 1970s when they were fighting for their lives against the Soviet and Chinese backed North Vietnamese forces. Now, am I saying that the Ukrainian government is perfect and flawless and beautiful and not corrupt and doesn't have its problems, including PR problems? No, I'm not saying that. But the world is not going to be a better place if Russia gains victory over Ukraine. And I'm thinking of the longer geopolitical interests in the United States when I say that. Because as Dmitry Medvedev, had stated a few years back, the real goal of the war in Ukraine is all about creating a Eurasian Union from Vladivostok to Lisbon. So keeping that in mind, that is why I'm a supporter of Ukrainian independence against the Russians. Jeff, are you similarly disturbed by what's going on with Ukraine's reputation, with the right, with the left, etc.?
Well, yeah, I'm disturbed by it because, if a country has to be perfect to have independence or exist or be supported, or to be an appropriate country to support for our survival, to prevent our enemy from getting a key land area that would allow them their next, position to attack from. If it has to be perfect, then we're in trouble because we're not perfect. And there are people on the right today, and it's very disturbing to me. They think that Ukraine is some kind of demonic, satanic. I heard this. I was in a meeting of some friends here, and somebody said, there's this. What is this Khazar conspiracy? And somebody said, oh yeah, who are the Khazars? Well, the Khazars, they're the Ukrainians.
That's a first.
Right?
I've never heard
Yeah, I
that.
found this map and it showed the Khazars and it's right where Ukraine is. And it's like they are mixing conspiracy theories related to the Jews. They're mixing David Duke up with, the current situation in Ukraine. And people have gotten you look at these neo Nazis and other people who are anti-Ukrainian, and they're attacking. Obviously, they have a Jewish president, and are also attacking Ukraine for being a Nazi formation, supposedly. It's so ridiculous, the Jewish Nazis in Ukraine. This propaganda is so clearly coming from the Russians, and so clearly marks every single lie that the Russian, information services have been putting out, that you can see through it. But people on the right believe it because they see a country that they identify, since Biden is supporting them. Biden is evil. The American government is evil, and I've run into this for 20 something years writing for WorldNet Daily and Financial Sense. So many of my readers say, Jeff, we're living under a police state in America. America's evil. And these same people now more recently have been telling me, Putin's a nationalist, he's against homosexuality, he's against this, so Putin is good. And this is, I hate to say it, but this is, I don't want to offend people, but this is morally confused.
Mm.
If your country, your government, it's a very complicated thing. The government is not a country. The government is the government, and then there's the country and the people. And all government has things bad in it. And there's corruption in every country, and there's good people and there's bad people. And nothing's pure. And if it has to be pure for us to support it, we're all in trouble because, I think America and I've heard people say this, God's going to judge America. We need to be destroyed because we're so evil. It's like, well, who's evil exactly? And this is really so mixed up because you look at the abortion rate in Russia. I remember 30 years ago, the average Russian woman had 7 abortions on average.
Mm.
Now I know the average, it's lower
Horrible.
now, right? It's lower now, but look, you still have the average Russian woman has had more abortions than the average American woman.
Mm.
And on Easter,
Terrible.
the average number of Russians that go to church on Easter are 4%. We have, I think, 30 something percent go to church on Easter. So America is condemned as being this horrible satanic country, and Russia is a Christian country. But we have 9 times as many people going to church on Easter Sunday than they do. It's this kind of thing. And when I've tried to explain it to people, the prejudice I feel is so deep, and the misjudgment, and so when is it that your country is so bad that you have to flee it or you have to turn against it, right? Well, I use Hannah Arendt, who wrote the 3-volume work on totalitarianism, because I feel, viscerally, and have studying this my whole life, that there is what totalitarianism is, what evil is, as opposed to a normal country with all the good and bad that's in it. There is a discontinuity when you enter into a totalitarian phase of your government where it is completely lawless. The people are committing murders openly, where there is no chance of free speech to address anything by a normal political process or normal discussion. When you have reached that point, and I don't know how far away we are from that point, but we haven't crossed it, because there's still a continuity here in this country. However bad it's gotten, there is a point at which you absolutely know it is not the same country anymore. At which point to expect someone like me to be arrested, that anyone who opposes totalitarianism is in danger. And that isn't right now. They are not arresting people just simply for having a different opinion. I mean, they're using this a kangaroo court kind of thing to go after President Trump. And they've done this with the January 6 people. I know all that. The system is imperfect. We got bad people in the Justice Department. But that ultimate break where they're completely lawless and there is no restrictions on the behavior, we're not there yet. And then to go to Ukraine and say, because these bad people in America, in Washington, in the White House, are supporting Zelensky, that somehow makes Zelensky bad. That makes Ukraine, and that it somehow makes Putin good. See, this is all part of a complex. Where Putin is the Christian nationalist and Zelensky is the evil Jewish Nazi. Look, we have to have clarity. And I don't know everything, and this is very complicated, but just to try to cut through it and be clear, Zelensky is a Russian-speaking Ukrainian Jewish person who was a comedian. You have to understand him in that context. And he does not, when he stands in front of the United Nations and he says that he is going to, we are not living up to our global warming, obligations to cut back on greenhouse gases. He is pandering to what he knows rules the roost in Washington, Berlin, and Paris. That is what he needs. He is desperate. His country is dying. His cities are being bombed and hit by missiles. The Russians just started the other day attacking their power infrastructure again in Ukraine, their electrical power grid. So he's desperate. He knows who controls the governments here, and so he's appealing to them. And then, of course, when he appoints Marina Abramovich to being or he asked her to be an ambassador abroad. If the UK Telegraph story is true, if he asked her that, he's not doing it because he knows she's a witch. I saw the comments on X, on Twitter, that he knows that. He's just, he's a devil worshiper too. It's like, let's be reasonable, people. The guy does not have that good English, and he doesn't know anything about our political history. He doesn't understand how we see her. He doesn't probably never heard of her before, to be honest. You think because you know her and she's in the English, these people don't read English books. They don't read our press. They read their press. They read Ukrainian and Russian things. They live in a different world with different language. So you think that, and you think that the Russians aren't playing a game, trying to use a divide and conquer to get us to hate them, to cut them off, because the Russians are our enemy. Russia has thousands of nuclear weapons pointed at America, and they have invaded Ukraine, and they're allied with China, who want to destroy us. And you think Ukraine is evil? Ukraine is our natural ally. Let's have some clarity here. Ukraine's not perfect. We're not perfect. If my country has to be perfect for me to defend it, then I'm dead. I don't have a country. Nobody will ever have a country. If my parents have to be perfect for me to be a good son, then there can be no good son, because no parents are perfect, right?
Yeah, I mean, let's take a look. I mean, Putin guns down journalists. The Gulag is still open, producing goods made by forced labor, at least for domestic consumption in Russia. You have torture and execution still common.
They've kidnapped, the Russians have kidnapped tens of thousands of Ukrainian children.
Correct.
Taken them from their parents.
Correct. In these re-education centers, so to speak, too, as well, as they more or less call them. You look at their war plans against the United States, which involves nuclear weapons. It's a horrible way to do warfare. You look at their subversion of Europe. You look at their massive unfair trade practices, even formally against the United States. I mean, you look at assassinating, as I said, defectors who were considered traitors with polonium, with radiation, which is
using nerve agent to kill political dissidents and to kill defectors abroad.
Exactly. So this is not, we don't gun down journalists in the street. I mean, for goodness sakes, we have radical organizations that have ties to hostile foreign powers that, at least on paper, are allowed to exist.
There's incredible tolerance here. In the U.S. You know, it's very funny. You know, I understand the frustration. But we just had Roe versus Wade struck down in the United States. And so here's the thing, is that you have to get this right. China and Russia are allied, and they're coming for you. They hate you. They will do anything to divide you and conquer you. They will set Americans against Americans. They will put Americans against Europe. They'll put Americans against Japan and Australia. They will put black against white, man against woman. It's a divide and conquer kind of strategy. They always use it. They used it in Ukraine, trying to get East Russian-speaking Ukrainians against Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians. Guess what? It doesn't work. All Ukrainians are united now. And the Russian-speaking Ukrainians, and my friends are mostly among the Russian-speaking Ukrainians, are like, no way. We want to speak Ukrainian now. We don't want to use the Russian language. And all the lies about the persecution of Russian speakers, it's just the incredible lies. And, you know, I go on the radio and I have these sweet conservative people, and they just attack me. You don't know what you're talking about. They're killing, you know, they're persecuting, they're calling, you know, Eastern Ukraine, the Ukrainian government is evil and they're evil Nazis. And it's like, no. That's Russian propaganda, please. Those are Russian lies.
Yes, and this is what concerns me, and you can take as much time to talk about this, because this is, I think, an important question. And I'll start out, the reason why I originally became a Republican is because I was a young anti-communist. They were the stronger party against communism and the Russian threat. What happened? Why don't they know these statistics with these insane high abortion rates in Russia, the low church attendance, the threats that Russia remains? Why isn't all of this stuff that you and Jimmy from Brooklyn and me and Trevor Loudon and a handful of other people, why isn't all this research being reported? What has gone wrong? Take as much time as you want to talk about.
Well, because our media is full of leftists, educated at our universities, which has the wokeism, conservatives in America are alienated from the mainstream media. Many conservatives are even alienated from Fox News. And so where do they get their media? They get their media from their phone. They're listening to these crazy people. Some of them are anti-Semites, talking about the Khazars, the Jews, the Nazis, the Illuminati, whatever they're talking about, who don't know what they're talking about. And trust me, they don't. Who have all these books that they'll throw at you that are half-baked, and they link everything to the conspiracy land. And Nevin, you're Jewish. You understand this history of conspiracy theory, the protocols of the elders of Zion, the Jewish Masonic conspiracy idea that Napoleon's head of secret police Fouché put out. That I was talking to Alex Benish, a German researcher. He's saying, that Robeson's proofs of a conspiracy. This guy was an agent of the British, aristocratic espionage system. The
Yes, yes. I
conspiracy
didn't know that. I
theory.
learned something new. I don't mean to
Yeah.
interrupt. I learned something new from Alex and you regarding that.
Oh
Thank
yeah. This guy's written 10 books and has been working on this for years. And it's like, this is important because, the German language, they have their knowledge and their history, and you can learn so much from these little bits of history that you go, oh my gosh, I didn't realize it's not that there's a Jewish conspiracy, is that Jews, that the aristocrats from the Middle Ages forward preferred to use Jews as spies.
Well, even the KGB even viewed the Jews by taking advantage with the anti-Semitic trope, according to a Soviet document dated from 1986, to take advantage of the Jews because they had their anti-Semitism. Of course, the KGB, they viewed them as greedy and possessed with self-interest, and therefore that would be good to be used for spies, both within the Soviet Union.
But in reality, it's because they were vulnerable.
Right. Exactly.
Because they were vulnerable, they were easier to press into service and manipulate because they weren't allowed in the guilds, they weren't allowed to own certain kinds of land, they were persecuted. And so you got a persecuted person, he's thinking, well, what choice do I have here? This guy seems to like me, he wants to pay me to do this, it's kind of unsavory, I better do it, right?
Yeah.
So this history is so... The thing to understand about this use of conspiracy theories, look, Alex Jones, we should touch on this. Alex Jones someone was telling me how he was now recently interviewed by Russians, one of these Russian TV personalities, one of the famous ones that makes, threatens nuclear war on Russian TV, threatens America and the UK with nuclear annihilation. What's his name again? Anyway, he interviewed Alex Jones and he said, Jones said, I'm being persecuted here. He says, why don't you come here? We'll set you up. You can do your show right here. Think about that for a minute. See, the thing is that you've got to understand what side you're on. I'm an American. But that doesn't mean, if my government goes bad, I'm in the same position that the people who plotted against Hitler were. If my government goes that way. I'm not going to, patriotism means, yes, I'm patriotic to my country. It means I don't owe traitors and criminals that are in the government anything, right? And the thing is that you have to understand, as long as the Constitution exists, as long as there's continuity, you have to try to save the country. You have to try to make it work. But the minute that continuity is broken, you have a problem in the country. And in Russia, they lied, they cheat, they steal, they're murdering their own young men in this front, using them as cannon fodder. They've invaded this country of Ukraine. They destroyed the city of Mariupol. They've destroyed almost half the city of Kharkiv. They've wrecked other cities and villages and towns, and they've massacred tens of thousands of civilians. and they've killed and wounded 500,000 soldiers in this war on both sides. That's for what? Because of these lies that the Russians give? It's outrageous. And it's outrageous that conservatives believe these lies. And I saw Vivek Ramaswamy on the debate last night. That man needs a sock stuffed in his mouth. I'm joking. He has the freedom to speak. But it's outrageous for him to say that we have no business giving aid to Ukraine, that we have to use the money here and we have to sell our own. We're a rich country. We can sell our own border and we can help stop this thing in Europe from spreading. Because if the Russian, some of the other people there were absolutely right. If the Russian army reaches the border of NATO by going through Ukraine, that Russian army has tactical nuclear weapons in numbers that Europe cannot match. And
Correct.
Europe is not ready. Europe is not ready for war. Ukraine is more ready to fight them than Europe is. They get through Ukraine, they're going to go through Europe fast if they want to. And they're aligned with China. Yeah.
The Russians are already subverting Europe politically anyways, too. On top of that, I wanted to circle back concerning the political right. And look, you and I, we have, our own political beliefs, but I can admit that the conservatives, they have on the surface a good message, the strong families, more entrepreneurial, independent entrepreneurialism, strong national defense. It's all stuff we can agree with. So I'm not hostile to the basic goals, and nor are you. But I say this with deep concern. I think what happened where the conservative movement really took a bad turn, I'm not saying it's their fault necessarily, was in the late 1980s when Gorbachev, through spokespeople like Arbatov, the KGB, the International Department, there was a program to eliminate the image of the enemy, to disarm the military-industrial complex, to make it irrelevant. And what happened was we were put to sleep. You've done a lot of research on that. I have, others have. It's pretty much a conclusion. The Russians continue to build. The columnist for Pravda, who was no ordinary columnist, Dmitry Sudakov, a few years ago, wrote an article basically poking fun at the fact that, the West was taking in, while they were smashing up their tanks, we kept on building our armaments to achieving massive numerical superiority. We can debate whether Russia matched against the United States could beat the United States. That's a different discussion, a different time, which I hope I never have to have.
Well, they were laughing at the fact that he actually says, and it's a two-part article in Pravda, he actually says the United States is in a hopeless strategic position now. We are surpassing you, and you can't ever catch up. And it's not just Russia, it's Russia and China together. And Russia's only problem is they need to put Ukraine back into the Union.
Yes. Yeah. And one of the things I do applaud former Governor Chris Christie, who actually talked about that. He's like, Putin wants to bring it all back. And I give him credit for vocalizing that. That was one of the few good points of the debate last night. But getting back where we're going, so Gorbachev was really a victor. In fact, Gorbachev bragged, and I discussed this, he bragged in 1988 that Ronald Reagan became a realist. Now, the term realist in Soviet communist speak means that an individual who no longer has an anti-communist or anti-Soviet thrust in their foreign policy. These are people that believe we can do business with the Soviet Union. I mean, Reagan obviously was not a communist, but he was somebody over time who believed we can do business with Gorbachev. Truth is, even in his first term, we kind of sort of did business with the Soviet Union. I'm an advocate of us decoupling from totalitarian countries economically. And that's what happened. And as the country, Ukraine, you look at Zelensky, some of his positions, and I'm not saying I disagree or agree with him. But when you look, as you touched upon, Jeff, where Zelensky has very socially liberal left positions, that triggers right-wing conservatives who are very, very focused on the cultural issues here in the United States. And when they see that, they're like, oh my God. And then they see the images of Vladimir Putin shirtless on a horse and a manly man with the big muscles. That appeals to them. I would argue, Jeff, that that is done purposely to divide the right. The Russians, you talked about it on Alex's show. You and I have talked about it. Both of us have written about it. The Russians have always had a program, and the Chinese too, I believe, to divide the right. When they divide the right through issues of free trade, let's trade with them, make lots of money. And then on the other end, Russia and China are Christian countries. Oh, I love when Xi Jinping said that. He opposed what he termed welfarism, for example. All these things, I believe, are trigger words to hook various elements of the right into the Russian-Chinese camp. And that is concerning because typically when we look at the right, they're the ones these days, these past number of decades, that are supposedly should be stronger on national security than the far left elements of the Democratic Party. So that's kind of how I see it. Would you agree with that, or do you have anything else to add? You've seen a lot of politics up close and personal, so let's see.
Well, what I would add is that in some sense, conservatives now have become more caught up in this notion that there's this evil, satanic conspiracy centered around the World Economic Forum, centered around the Council on Foreign Relations. It's the Burchard type conspiracy theory idea that the capitalists are the real conspiracy, that it's evil capitalism, big corporations that are the core of the conspiracy, and that even communism is just a big nothing burger anymore, and that the real evil is in the West, and that the real evil is our liberalism. So that what they've done is they've demonized their own domestic opponents because they're so disgusted by the wokeism and the left. What they have not realized is that the truly demonic people who want to exterminate them are the people in Beijing and Moscow who have the nuclear weapons aimed at them and the biological weapons, and that have the very extensive agent networks. Not only do those agent networks inspire the feminist movement, the homosexual movement, the all the wokeism, the environmentalist movement to shut down our petroleum industry and to shut down our coal industry and so on, and to corrupt our politicians and to corrupt our businessmen with giving them business deals in China and Russia. But they've also infiltrated the right, and they're giving the right these narratives that are, it's like Alexander Dugin, what was it, 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, Dugin was saying, you need to have a civil war in America. You need to have a civil war in Europe.
Oh, he's written about that before in
Yeah.
his treatises back, which are available in English, back from the 1990s. He's called for a civil war in the United States, including based on a racial and ethnic war, as well as class war, and the creations of anti-American blocs. In fact, in a debate with Dr. Olavo de Carvalho of Brazil, I mean, he basically admitted that in a debate with him a few years back, that he calls for this what is it, Islamic, Russian, Chinese power bloc to take on the corporate-led New World Order.
And Dugin has actually said, he's taken the speech of Cato the Elder used to give a speech in the Roman Senate that would end every single speech with and furthermore, Carthage must be destroyed. And this is what Dugin has said again and again, and America must be destroyed. He said that in Russian, not in English. Mm-hmm. But he is for the destruction of the United States of America. And he's made this appeal. He's been on Alex Jones. He's made these appeals, very dishonest appeals to Americans. But the reason they dream of having a civil war, Igor Panarin, the KGB colonel who taught at the KGB, famously at the KGB Academy, assigned with this business of studying a potential civil war in America back even before the fall of the Soviet Union, has been giving reports and talking and dreaming about a civil war in America for 30 years. You see him appearing every so many years. They drag him out again in his work. But they want, and there's a lot of, believe you me, there's a lot of Americans that they kind of want this bloodshed. They might want to fight the Civil War again, North and South. They might want to settle scores with enemies here in America. You see how they appeal to this bloody mindedness, this divisiveness, and they want to do it in Europe too because it's cui bono. Who benefits? Who benefits? Russia and China, our enemies, benefit.
Exactly. Couldn't have said it better. I wanted to reel back to the idea of the capitalist communist conspiracy. You brought that up, which is interesting because that's always been kind of an undercurrent with several organizations. I think it's kind of split the right-wing movement on that. And this notion that, yeah, you mentioned the capitalists controlling the communists and everything else, a conspiracy above communism. I mean, my thoughts, I agree with you. I think, and I've been highly critical of certain forms of capitalism and their interactions with totalitarian collectivist states that are expansionist. And I can tell you, I've researched this for death. You know that, you've read my writings.
Yeah.
It's not above communism. They're competing power blocks that collaborate and sometimes go to war with each other, and then they trade with both sides. It's a very complex thing. Look, it's justified to be upset about that kind of trade and collaboration, of course, because ultimately you're, as Paul Reusch, the German industrialist who said, folks, don't give money to the Nazis. Why? Because you're funding your gravediggers. And Solinsky talked about this too as a strategy. And the thing of it is, this is where I disagree. Look, I was a Birch Society member. I've met a lot of good people, including the writers. These are good people, salt of the earth people, as you even put it. But this notion that there's a conspiracy above communism and every other political formation or dynamic in this country, I just don't see the connections.
Well, let me give a point here, Nevin. If the conservatives, of the religious conservatives, can be duped by Putin, which many of them have been, and they can forgive themselves for that when they realize it, don't we realize that the Rockefellers and the Pierponts and the Morgans, when they invested in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and lost that investment when NEP ended, they were duped by Stalin and by Lenin, by the NEP. Everybody gets duped by these criminals. Yeah. Everybody, they don't just invest thinking, oh, I'm going to lose my money in Russia and China. They actually invested in China thinking, oh, the labor cost is easy. We're going to go and invest. We're going to make a lot of money. So all these German companies that went in there and lost their shirt, and the Chinese would say, what's the German car company? It's Mercedes. Not Mercedes, it's the other one.
BMW?
Audi.
Oh, Audi.
Oh,
sure, sure.
Yeah, and maybe it's BMW too. They go in there and then they get lured in, they build their factory, and the Chinese say, oh, you owe us $1 billion because you broke our laws. They just
that's been happening recently.
Them.
That's been happening recently in the news. If you follow, I don't mean to interrupt, but to take on your point, one good fellow who is one of the good guys in the business world that has really learned and has seen this is Kyle Bass.
Yes, Kyle Bass has really woken up to this. And the thing is that why demonize the victim of we're all victims of Chinese communist and Russian communist deception. We're victimized by their NEPs, by their, oh yeah, we're going to trade, they're going to change, they're going to become more democratic. China's going to, become more and more democratic over time because when they trade and they experience capitalism, they'll want more freedom. No, they're duping you because they're building their navy up, they're building their nukes up, they're stealing they're getting us to invest in, they can do this gene splicing where they're coming up with new dangerous viruses. They're subverting us, and it's not that we can ever subvert them with capitalism, but we fool ourselves. Francis Fukuyama fooled himself. We
Oh,
fooled it. Reagan got fooled.
yes.
So wait a minute, we're going to demonize Reagan, we're going to demonize the religious right, we're going to demonize our capitalists because all of them have been fooled by these people.
Sure. I'm sure maybe you and I were fooled at one time too. I was fooled. I mean, of course, you learn, you got to have intellectual integrity. You have the evidence. I got exposed to your writings and I dig deeper and I'm like, oh my God, wow. Even if, look, and I take a very hard line against a big portion of our billionaire class, but do I think it's historically accurate that they control the communist conspiracy? No. And the Russians also gain a lot from that. They can cause discontent with the system. And look, I get very upset at what goes on with the corruption, the plutocracy, and everything else. But people have to understand, I know you understand this, that the Chinese and the Russians profit from that. They don't want simply America strengthened or the contradictions of capitalism, as the Marxists put it, massaged out to make the system better and function better. No, they don't want that. They want to destroy it. They basically want to turn everybody, every social class, every woman against man, gay against straight, labor against capital, capital against labor. They want the social unrest. They want the political unrest. The Nazis had the same thing. I was recently reading a memorandum by Otto Abetz, who was the German ambassador to France under the Vichy period. And he stated it in a memo very clearly in 1940. He says, look, we're going to sometimes use the right and we're going to sometimes use the left because we don't want a strong, unified France. And this is during the occupation period. And that's one of the many discussed, very unsavory things about totalitarianism. It's their practice of strategic opportunism.
And the lying. The
Disgusting.
thing is that, yeah, everything they're telling you is a lie, and they have a different set of lies for different targets. They say this lie to the industrialists, this to the bankers, this lie to the certain politicians, this lie to the working people, this lie to the religious people. So they've got everything targeted. And so this is the thing people have to understand. Ukraine is being destroyed by this Chinese-Russian combination. And Taiwan is concerned that there's this buildup opposite them, that they're next, but those nukes are aimed at us.
Mm-hmm.
Their nukes are aimed to smash our cities. Their biological weapons are tuned to kill us. And they've infiltrated our government. And they've got our businessmen on the hook with the money that they've invested. How many pension funds are invested in China? I know the California retirement system for the California state employees is invested in China. Mm-hmm. And so many universities and schools and other institutions retirements invested in China. Look, people, it isn't that you are going to be victims of this. It isn't that you're evil, but don't be stupid. Don't believe a word out of Moscow, not a word out of China, and it's disgraceful if you do. You're a disgrace to believe a palpable lie and to be so ignorant that you don't know enough about the world to even recognize it's a lie right off the top. I can look at it and go, oh, I know that lie, and that lie. Most people just haven't done their homework. And I remember when I taught high school people, Mr. Nyquist, why do we have to know this? Because they are lying to you on TV. And you have to be able to tell when they're lying to you. And you can't tell if you don't know anything and if you can't find the country of Ukraine on a map, which most of them can't. Sorry to say.
Yeah, yeah, it's unfortunate. So, yeah, and I think that's where the conservative movement went wrong. And there were voices that spoke out in the late 1980s against the appeasement of Gorbachev. It's not like that was unknown. You had Howard Phillips, you had former Senator Jesse Helms. I think people are ignorant, but I think a lot of it has to do with, and I hate to say it, and I hate to sound harsh, there's a lack of intellectual integrity. And the Russians and the Chinese also study like elements of the business community, many elements of the multinational business community. They see something of the phenomenon, it's called corporate psychopathy, where there's no conscience. And, Thomas Jefferson talked about it, merchants have no country other than the wares that they sell. He said that, wrote that in private correspondence, which you can find online as a primary source.
I think,
and what they do is
I want to say something. I think that some of that was exaggerated back then because I think there were a lot of very patriotic business people.
Sure.
But today, as our morals have eroded and our intellectual integrity, as you say, has eroded, we're in a crisis of moral values and intellectual integrity. And this is something I point out. Look, the Origins of the Fourth World War, my book, I begin it with the problem of decadence. The fact that we have moral decline, intellectual decline, it is no joke. Our civilization was built on character and intellectual knowledge. Really developing ideas. And it's not that we're perfect, we're omniscient, anybody has it all figured out. It's that discussion, it's that trying, it's that struggling towards the truth, it's that groping towards what is right that matters. And when people stop doing that and say, oh, it's just about making money and I don't care about what's true and chopstick politics, it's all the same to me, I'm sorry, but you've crossed a line. And you are going to get a totalitarian system if that's who you are.
Yeah, and then their heads are going to be chopped off, so to speak, afterwards. It's almost like our job, and I wanted to go into more about Ukrainian disinformation before we depart from this topic. It's like I feel like you have to kick these people, not kick these people, drag them kicking and screaming, like, no, no, no. It's like, billionaires under the guillotines, that's not going to usher in a better society for the United States. It's like, no, China, billionaires getting guillotined by the Russians and the Chinese and their allies and extremists in the United States. No, it's not good. You're going to drag your butts kicking and screaming back into a sense of self-preservation for the long term. It's a very complex issue, and I think our discussion here hits upon that, and we've discussed this many times, and that's why I don't like the conspiracy theory, because even if you feel these people within the elites are, quote, evil or bad, it's a lot more complex. That requires a lot more study than saying, oh, it's just a conspiracy, end of discussion. It's
look, I agree. I think Anthony Sutton, who was kicked out of the Hoover Institute, I think he deserved to be kicked out. I read his books, and there's a lot of interesting scholarship there, but his methodology is inside out and backwards.
Exactly.
He says that you go out, when you do social science, you go out to prove something, and you basically cherry pick what you want to prove it. That's not social science. It's the falsifiability principle. And he states it at the beginning of his book on Skull and Bones. And it's like, I'm reading it and I'm shocked and I'm going, that is not the right methodology for social science. So you start, you are a scholar at the Hoover Institution, and you just now inverted the correct methodology?
Yeah, his first book, which I believe was 2 volumes, Western Technology, came out in the Soviet Union. It came out in the late 1960s. That was very good scholarship. Afterwards, he, in his books on the trade with the Soviet Union, to a lesser degree other communist countries, He has a lot of great information and some good anecdotal
But the problem
points.
is with the interpretation of the information.
Correct.
When you make the people out to be the devil who are just doing business, look, you forget to tell people that the Bolsheviks were claiming they were going back to capitalism. That Lenin himself said, we're giving up, we don't know how to make socialism, so we're going back to capitalism. So people thought, oh, okay, the Bolshevik thing is done. So why wouldn't people want to make money there? So there's a problem there. So you demonize the people who are basically fooled and who lose their money, by the way, investing in the Soviet Union, and you claim they're really creating the Soviet Union, but that's not really the right interpretation.
Right. It's always more complex than that. Where
There's a book, by the way, it's called Red Carpet by Joseph Finder, which
yeah, I
goes
have.
through all of the major capitalists who invested in the Soviet Union in the 20s and how much money they lost. And I remember I was with Colonel Lunev he held a little press conference years
Yeah.
ago. It was August of 1998. And people said, one reporter said, what do you say about investing in the Soviet or investing in the Russian Federation? He says, don't do it. You'll lose your money. Right? You could say the same thing at the beginning of NEP. You could say the same thing about investing in China. You are going to lose your money. Don't be stupid. These people are lying to you. They're communists.
Well, you look at the Nazis. You've heard of the famous industrialist Fritz Thyssen.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah.
He
A lot
said,
of
"What
those
a
guys ended up in
dump-off I was
concentration
being
camps. Yeah.
protected. What a dump-off."
Yeah. And he
You know?
admitted he was dumb.
Yeah, he admitted it.
He
He
admitted it
really
later.
did. He effed up. Family-friendly show because I'm not going to use profanity. So yeah,
Well,
yeah.
no, and look, people thought, okay, even, the great Admiral Canaris, who was the head of the German military intelligence, thought when he first met Hitler, oh, the guy's good. He's for, strengthening the country. But he figured out pretty early on, within about a year, he realized this guy's really evil.
Yeah.
And he started working against Hitler behind the scenes. So, and of course, ultimately got hanged for it. And so the thing we have to understand is that yes, it's a very complicated world, and the facts. People think if they have facts, oh, these capitalists gave money to Hitler and they gave money to Stalin and they give money to China. It's like, no, you don't understand. They were all deceived. And now the people on the right, on the religious right, are being deceived that Putin is a Christian and Putin is a nationalist. See, we're all tricked in our own way, and we all have to grow up and say, all right, no more. We don't believe them anymore.
Exactly. Now, I mean, because now getting back into Ukraine, and of course, I love our discussions on capitalism, but I want to shift it to Ukraine because we hear these myths about, oh, and these exaggerations and revelations of Victoria Nuland, masterminding the coup in 2014, discussions of the Azov battalions to Ukraine as Nazi, even though you have Russian neo-Nazis fighting on behalf of the Russian military and the
That's
Donetsk
right.
People's Republic, like the RNU, what is it, the Russian National Unity Party, and you have German neo-Nazis training in camps under the aegis of groups like the Imperial Russian Federation and even the Russian government. You have the German NPD making pilgrimages to the Russian Federation. On and on it goes.
The Russians are up to their hips on their little alliances with different Nazi groups around the world.
It's insane. And so let's unpack Victoria Nuland, the neo-Nazis, Ukraine suppressing these parties. When I look up these parties and churches, they're all affiliated with the Russians. The Socialist Party of Ukraine, I think it's called. They have a Communist Party. I think it's Socialist Party. One of its socialist parties are affiliated with the Lyndon LaRouche Network, and the Lyndon LaRouche Network calls for an alliance with Russia and China. I mean, the list goes on and on. So when
Look, after the Euromaidan revolution, the number of people, when you look at the people elected to the first parliament, you can count on the fingers of one hand out of hundreds of members of the Rada there in Ukraine. You can count on the fingers of one hand the number of people who could be even remotely described as Nazis in their parliament. It is not a Nazi parliament. And the guy that financed the Azov battalion, Mr. Kolomoisky, the Jewish oligarch who built many synagogues, is not a Nazi. He wouldn't have given money to the Azov battalion if it was really a bunch of Nazis.
Why
Right?
don't we hear about this, Jeff? Why don't we hear?
Because it's a, if you read a paper, I read a scholarly paper on the Azov movement. The Azov movement comes out of Moscow via Kharkiv or Kharkov, a Russian-speaking Ukrainian city. They are Russian-speaking Ukrainians. There are these two guys that flirted with these ideas, and they formed this Azov battalion. But the people who joined it weren't of their movement. They just named it that because these two guys did it. It was not, and they never required, there was no ideological requirement to join. It's just like some guy, Lee Harvey Oswald was in the Marine Corps and he was a Marxist. So is the Marine Corps Marxist because one guy in it's a Marxist? Or his even platoon is Marxist? No, it's not. Is a battalion Marxist because two of the leaders that helped form the volunteer battalion were like these ideas? No, it's not. And so is the symbolism of the Azov battalion a Nazi symbol? No, it's letters from the Ukrainian alphabet that were removed under the Soviet Union from the alphabet, right?
Mhm.
That's not Nazi. I'm sorry, but there's misrepresentations. And of course, you want to talk about Victoria Nuland. Everybody's heard the phone call. The Russians recorded it. Victoria Nuland, a U.S. diplomat associated with the EU, talking to Mr. Piat, the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, talking about, now here they've had this revolution where millions of people stood up. The government shot down, they call them the Heavens 100. It probably was under 100 people got murdered. And the government got so afraid because they'd done this horrible violence, they fled. The prime minister fled, the president Yanukovych fled to Russia. They fled. They abdicated. They weren't overthrown. By the way, if you feel guilty because you've done something bad and you've made your people angry and your bodyguards don't want to protect you anymore, if you flee to another country, is it a coup?
No.
It's an abdication. It's your big screw up. You screwed up. He abdicated. He was lawfully the president and he abandoned his position. He didn't stay there and say, "Look, I'm the president. I made a mistake. I screwed up." What do you do when you order your own fellow citizens shot down with guns? How do you apologize? You're afraid. It's on you. You're going to be put on trial for this. There's going to be a process. So he fled. And of course, it was his guilt that made him flee, like so many other officials, including governors and SBU officials and generals. A lot of people fled, people who are agents of Russia, because what? Russia was holding down Ukraine. So you have Piat and you have Victoria Nuland saying, these young Ukrainians are saying, we don't, they imagine they don't have a government. They have to have elections. They haven't a lot of these people have never really been involved in politics before. It's like you have the two brothers that were wrestlers, the twins, do we run for, and they became famous through the process of standing up to the government. What do we do? So they asked some American diplomats for advice. Is that an American coup? No, it's not. And if Americans say, well, we don't want, he doesn't have enough experience, talking about Klitschko. He shouldn't really run, whatever. That's not a coup. Sorry, listen to the tape closely. Use your judgment. Use common sense. This is not a coup. This is not evidence of anything that it's claimed to be. It's not. But yet these claims are made.
Well, now we have also recently testimony, including an American, Jimmy Dore, who's a hardline, quote unquote, anti-imperialist. And I mean, all he talks about is basically damning all American efforts to contain Russia and China. What a disappointment. And he testified before the UN. This was organized, it seems, by the Russian Federation, because there I saw the ambassador on the video of this testimony, the ambassador of the Russian Federation to the United Nations. And the accusation that it's a foregone fact that the United States blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Fact or fiction? What's going on, Jack?
Not according to Scandinavian journalists that started tracking Russian ships before the pipeline was blown up. You know, and so you are going to trust this communist, I'm just going to call him a communist, this communist journalist who's been flacking for America's enemies his whole career, Seymour Hersh. You're going to trust him when he has one source, and not even a reliable source, claiming this happened. And I've talked to people who have worked in the Pentagon and people who are involved in military contracting and people all over the place. And you know what? There is no, it's like people would say, well, if we did it, I would know that. And you don't know that. No, I don't. I don't think we did it. You know, when you talk to enough people, you go, there's no evidence we did it. Some people I know in our establishment thought we didn't do it. Maybe the British did it. But when you go to these there's online, there's some Scandinavian journalists. They started tracking these Russian ships that were cutting fiber optic cables, going into Norway, going into Sweden. And they were tracking the ships, and they tracked the Russian special operations ship. Before that Nord Stream pipeline was blown up, that ship was over the place where it blew up. I think it was, 8 days before? It was there, and they ran into it, and they pulled rifles up on the deck. They were going to shoot him if they didn't get out of there. And they were like, nope. The Russians were there, and that's the special operations ship that has a little submarine that goes down and plants the bombs. That ship, that Russian ship, and they had documented it beforehand, and the German media would not broadcast it. You won't find it on American media, but you'll find it in Denmark and Sweden and Norway.
Again, why, and also, is it not reported? And why would I'm saying this, you and I know the answer why. How would Russia benefit from that?
Yeah, well, you see, the thing is Russia, for them, gas and oil are weapons. And if Germany suffers, look, the Germans already have built the pipes to put the pipeline back together again, to repair it. It's already set. And there's people in Germany, pro-Russian people, they're ready to move tomorrow and get that pipeline going again. They're ready like that. And so, but the Russians want the Germans to be, Germany is suffering, right? They let themselves, they accepted the Green New Deal of Germany. They got rid of all these nuclear plants. They got rid of their coal. They then were going to rely on Russian natural gas, right? Clean natural gas. They're going to rely on that. And the Russians, we have them. And, you know, going all the way back to Nixon, the Nixon administration said, don't do this pipeline with Russia. Reagan said, don't do this pipeline with Russia. Trump said, don't do this pipeline with Russia. What did they do? They laughed at the Americans. Oh, you're paranoid about the Russians. They do the pipeline with them. And what happens?
And Nixon and Reagan and Trump were correct. And Brezhnev said, back even in the early 70s, 73, 1973 was when that pipeline went online. It was called the Friendship Pipeline, I think. And Brezhnev said it would change the face of Europe and relations between the Soviets and the FRG. That was what West Germany was known as, the Federal Republic of Germany, which is what it's called today, too.
And as soon as that pipeline is flowing, they invade Ukraine, thinking that the Germans don't dare go against them because that will be cut off.
And I would argue that this shows the thorough Russian penetration. If that story could be spiked about the Scandinavian journalists, and you don't hear from these hardcore leftists that love Russia, that salivate over Russia, and damn Ukraine is this Nazi human rights violating horrible country through and through. They never talk about how this pipeline is getting back online. Somehow that's not discussed. And especially that the Scandinavian ships, the Scandinavian journalists coming across this Russian special operations ship, with a mini submarine on top of it. A few days before the blowing up of the pipeline.
Yeah,
You see, the Russians use provocation. And Russia is still, in regards to military and intelligence policy, is a fundamentally Soviet country, I would argue.
Oh, absolutely.
Sandinistas used to kill their own supporters in Nicaragua during the 1980s. There was a special unit trained by the East Germans to kill Sandinista supporters and blame it on the FDN, which was the so-called Contras. I don't like using that term, but for the sake of familiarity, I'll use it. During the Russian Civil War, the Red Army used to kill Russian peasants, pin notes on them saying that the Greens did it. The Greens in Russia at the time, at the Russian Civil War, were the anarchists. So they wanted to blame the anarchists. The German Nazis, in attacking Poland, they wanted to make it seem that the Poles were attacking Germany. So they had this whole elaborate deception that Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich had carefully did.
They dressed prisoners up in Polish uniforms and gunned them down by a German radio station.
So you don't think the Russians are not going to necessarily do that? That splits NATO like they're no idea.
Well, and the game here, Nevin, is to get the balance of power in Germany so that the Germans just say, to heck with NATO, we're going with the Russians, screw Ukraine. And the minute they win over Germany, the Moscow believes they have Europe. Lisbon to Vladivostok, just like Dmitry Medvedev said, we're going to own it all the way down to Portugal, all the way to Vladivostok, the whole Eurasian landmass. It's going to be ours. That's what they are trying to do with this. And the war allows them to place this pressure on Germany and to place this pressure. And you know, the president of France, Macron, he went to China, and what did he do? He comes back and he says, oh, maybe we don't want to support America in its wars anymore. In other words, we don't want to support Ukraine.
That's right.
Maybe we're going to go with Russia. So what is the president of France? You know he's already bad. You know that de Gaulle was bad in that way.
Yeah.
In the internal politics of France, de Gaulle found that he could use the communists to get advantage internally within his own group.
There was a KGB defector, Alexei Myagov, I believe his name was, and he defected, and he said that de Gaulle's partial withdrawal or ejecting American troops from France and his more anti-NATO positions was actually considered a victory by the Soviets.
Oh, in 1964, yeah, France dropped out of NATO.
And that's what a Soviet KGB, I think he was a major, had said.
So, I mean, it was, and de Gaulle, basically, he disrupted the Western alliance. France is a significant military power.
Sure.
You know, back then it certainly was. And a nuclear power, too. So, you know, anyway, it's the complexities of the politics and the way that individual politicians look. This French intelligence officer, his code name was Lama. He wrote a book. He was the guy that basically was forced to defect to the United States when Golitsyn brought forward the information about top people in de Gaulle's organization being Soviet KGB agents. He basically said, look, de Gaulle used the communists for his political advantage, and he was very disappointed at de Gaulle's ambition, let us say, and his unscrupulousness, which he saw during World War II in de Gaulle's behavior. So we have, you know, unscrupulousness on the part of Eisenhower, unscrupulousness on the part of FDR. And so you can't cheat an honest man. How did Stalin swindle FDR and Churchill at Yalta? It was our own fault. Our own lack of integrity allows them to trick us. Yeah. And so if there's any message I have here for Americans is you must have judgment, but you must have integrity and honesty. And you must say, look, if you don't know about this stuff, learn, or then just be quiet. Don't buy into the Russian lies. Know where your information comes from. If you're listening to the convicted child molester Scott Ritter giving Russian propaganda, right?
Sorry.
Giving Russian propaganda, he's a lying bastard. Sorry.
And he's a mean one. If you see
He's
him
a
on
horrible man.
Twitter,
And the
he's
same thing
really,
with Colonel Douglas McGregor. When he goes on Tucker Carlson, I'm sorry, Tucker, you're a dupe. How can you be so dumb? Colonel Douglas McGregor comes on there and says, oh yeah, 400,000 Ukrainians have died and been wounded, and only, what did he say, 40, 50,000 Russians have died. I mean, that's McGregor, that he's trying to say the Russians have won the war. He's been saying that from day 10 of the war. The Russians have already won. The Russians have already won. We're more than a year and a half into the war. The Russians are on the defensive. They're not winning. I'm sorry, Mr. McGregor, you're a liar.
well,
Douglas McGregor, I have interviewed you, Douglas McGregor, and I know you, and you are a liar. You're spreading Russian lies, and you are gonna pay one day. When you meet your maker, you're gonna pay for those lies.
Well, I didn't know. Before we go, wow, I'm a little flummoxed there. I mean, Douglas McGregor, I mean, he tweeted on X saying that, oh, the notion that the Chinese and Russians want to land on the shores of America is a fantasy, and he was quite nasty and sharp about that. I didn't realize you interviewed him.
Yeah, years ago, I got somebody advised that I look him up and I interview him, and I had him on. And, he had some idiosyncratic opinions, but he'd been a warrior. He'd been this great soldier. And, we talked about what the battle of, 70-something Easting, 73 Easting, whatever it is. It was a tank battle, and he recounted the battle. It was an interesting interview. But I have to say, this man there is something deeply disturbing in him. And it's just plain a lie. You cannot believe. In fact, somebody on YouTube, a military expert, went through his interview with Carlson, fact by fact checked everything. It was just a stream of nonsense, of counterfactual nonsense. And, and he says it with such authority. And people, I know lots of my friends, they believe him. And I'm sorry to offend you. If you believe a lie, if I say it's a lie, don't be offended. I'm offended. Be humbled by the fact that you've made a mistake. My gosh, I mean, I'm horribly embarrassed when I make a mistake, and I make them enough. Goodness knows, but these are very serious mistakes, because people's lives, Ukraine and our country's security is on the line. And if those people, those enemies of ours, reach that border of NATO, and they're aligned with the China, that might be the actual, all right, China now goes. Russia's army reaches the border of NATO. Now they can directly press against us. So now China can directly move in the Pacific. You see how that works? People say, oh no, they can't, we're driving Russia into China's arms. I'm sorry, child, but China is already, and Russia have been aligned for decades already. We have defector testimony on this. Colonel Stanislav Lunev, I knew him personally. He was a Chinese-speaking, a Mandarin-speaking GRU officer. He worked in China. He knew they had made these agreements at the end of the Cold War to destroy the United States, to invade North America, to split the continent between them. It's a fact.
Yeah, you've documented. Heck, in my last book, in volume 1, I have a section on the Sino-Soviet split. It was vastly exaggerated. There was tons of collaboration. I mean, to this day, I still find tidbits. It's incredible. Like one KGB was in Mark Sauder's book on the POW MIA cover-up during the Vietnam War. There was I think it was either Red Army major or KGB major, said there was a hole, as he termed, in the Sino-Soviet border during the 60s and 70s where captured American technology was funneled from China to Russia. Give me a break. I just read a declassified archive from the Albania Albanian Party of Labor. That was the old ruling communist party. Now I think it's called the Socialist Party. Renamed itself. Well, in the early 70s, you had a delegation of Albanian military officers travel to North Vietnam, okay? Because Albania was aligned with Vietnam like the rest of the communist world, despite all the splits. Mm-hmm. So they went through 2 or 3 Warsaw Pact countries, including the Soviet Union. So if there was this horrifically irredeemable split between Albania, the Soviet Union, and China, why did the Soviets, and I think it was Hungary and Yugoslavia even, open their airports to a country that, despite being communist, they're hostile? Why? Because at the end of the day, communists are going to be unified when it comes to crushing imperialism, meaning the United States, meaning monopoly capital, which they'll use when it's convenient, and they'll play upon their greed, of course, but they'll kill them at the end.
Yeah, and that's the yin and way, as the Chairman Mao created. They let the businessmen make money. Why sew up their pockets, Mao said. Make them rich and they'll give us the political positions we need so that we can hang them all.
Yeah, and they hung them all. They cooperated with them. In the first few years of the People's Republic, purged them into the anti-riotist campaign by the mid-1950s. Saved a few, according to one report that I was reading, to serve as foreign trade negotiators well into the 60s, and then resurrected them in the 1980s. And then, God forbid, if they have world dominance, they'll probably kill half of them.
Yeah.
And that's how it goes.
That's how it goes. So, but anyway, Nevin, I think we covered it pretty good. But yeah, it's there's so much here, and there's so much disinformation, and I just wish people would don't take in this stuff about Khazars. Don't touch anything that's a Jewish conspiracy with a 10-foot pole. Stay away from the John Birch Society narratives about capitalists controlling the communist conspiracy. It's cracked. And I've gone through the books and I've looked at all the footnotes and I've looked at all the evidence. They don't have anything. It sounds good. It sounds like they got proof, but the proof is in the pudding. And if you're a researcher and you go through the footnotes, guess what? It just sort of evaporates as you go through it. It's not what they say it means.
If you want to look, I totally agree with you. They put out very good information on a factual level, but some of the conclusions you and I disagree with.
The interpretations are wrong. You can have all the facts in the world, and if you interpret them wrong, you're wrong.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. You've just misused the facts.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah. I think we covered a lot on the Ukraine. I think it was important we discussed the splits, and I'm finding new information. And why is that relevant? I'll close my point. Why are the Sino-Soviet split and the splits in the bloc so relevant? Because the lie continues to live today, that we're somehow pushing Russia into the arms of China. It's the same nonsense.
And the fact that Vivek Ramaswamy says that in a presidential debate means to me that he's dangerously ignorant. He's not just ignorant, he's a dangerous man. Because you cannot be a strategic illiterate and run for president of the United States. We can't have it because we may not survive as a country. We have to have leaders who actually understand strategy.
Look,
if we don't, we're making it because we've been so powerful before, but we're running out of our political and economic capital.
Yeah, we are. And look, I admire people who are immigrants who come to this country, they make something of themselves and become successful. And I think you would agree with me on that. I have no grudge against that necessarily, but I think, without going into details, I think he's being advised by people that are misled, maybe, to put it politely, and really it's deeply disturbing. And that's why I bring up the Sino-Soviet split and the Albanian Soviet split, because we haven't learned.
No, No. And the problem is, unless people get some humility and stop with the presumption already that you know things when you don't know anything, don't believe the nonsense. If you don't know if it's true, stay away from it until you can figure it out. And if it's, go and, play pinochle or something if you don't want to read. But don't get involved in politics and don't be spouting this nonsense. Please. What a mess we make.
Yeah. Well, on that note, Jeff, I think this has been a great discussion. I'm glad we were able to cover a lot of the Ukrainian disinformation points. I want to thank you personally, not only for appearing and taking the time, but also teaching me some things that I did not know. Because I don't know everything, you don't know everything. I have changed my views on certain things. I try to be careful, like you, with what you say and we say in our analysis. There are many sides to many different issues, and this has been, as usual, a great show, and I really appreciate all the information.
All right. Well, I appreciate it, Nevin. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, you're welcome. Everybody stay safe. God bless. Let's just pray for a safe and secure America that will survive in perpetuity. Thank you all. Have a great rest of the week.